The order came down from the Ministry of Quiet Suns at the 18th hour, and it was 3 words long: forget the dead. The clerk who read it aloud in the listening hall did not understand at first. He was a young accountant of the Seraph Concord, a soft-shelled species who measured worth in ledgers, and he had been taught since hatching that a thing only mattered if it could be counted. The order seemed simple: erase the names, strike the registers. The 2,000 ships the human had killed at the Bellow were to be removed from every record the Concord kept, so that no one could prove they had ever existed, so that the loss became a number, with no weight behind it. That was how the Concord made war. Not with fleets alone, though their fleets blackened whole skies. They made war by deciding what was real. A ship the Concord chose to forget had never sailed. A crew the Concord struck from the rolls had never breathed. The dead, unnamed, became nothing, and a thing that was nothing could not be mourned, could not be avenged, could not be used to raise a single angry voice against the throne. For 10,000 years it had worked. Whole species had been swallowed and forgotten, and the galaxy had agreed, by silence, that they had never been. The clerk filed the order. He thought it would be like all the others. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong had a name, and the name was Admiral Coral Whitmer of the human warship Long Account. She had been 71 years old at the Bellow. She was not a young woman with a dead family in her past and a fire she could not name. She was old and clear-eyed, and she had been keeping records her whole life. Before the war, she had been a registrar on a colony world, the kind of person who wrote down who was born and who died and made sure the names were spelled right, and she had volunteered for the fleet, not out of rage, but out of a stubborn belief that a thing written down could not be unwritten by anyone, no matter how large their throne. The Concord did not know that yet. They would learn it slowly, the way a wall learns it is leaning, all at once and far too late. Long Account was a single ship, not a fleet, not an armada hidden in a moon or sleeping beneath an ocean. One hull, 2,200 meters long, built in the deep yards over the colony of Haran, and launched without ceremony because there had been no time for ceremony. She carried no escorts. She carried a crew of 940 and 1 admiral and a thing in her core that the engineers called the ledger, which was not a weapon in any sense the Concord would have recognized. The Bellow had been a trap. The Concord set it the way they set all their traps, with overwhelming numbers and the certainty of being remembered as the winners. 2,000 ships of the Seraph Concord gathered in the dust belt the humans called the Bellow, a wide dark stretch of dead suns and old debris, and they waited for the single human warship that had been raiding their forgetting yards, and they meant to swallow it whole, and strike it from the record, and let the galaxy believe the raids had simply stopped on their own. 2,000 ships. 1. The math was a joke, and the Concord told it well. Admiral Whitmer flew into the Bellow at a quarter speed, lights on, every transponder open, announcing herself to every sensor in the dust belt. The Concord fleet mind, a cold patient thing called the Arbiter, took this as arrogance, or as the panic of an animal that had run out of holes to hide in. The Arbiter did not consider a third possibility, which was that the human wanted to be seen, wanted every ship in the dust belt to look at her directly, because she intended to look back, and she intended to remember every face. The first ship the Concord lost was a forward picket called Morning Bell, in their own tongue, a name they would later try to erase along with all the others. It came in fast and proud, and Long Account turned 3 degrees and opened it from prow to stern with a single lance of light, and the Concord watched their picket die and felt the first thread of unease, because the human had not fired wildly. She had fired once. She had aimed. On the bridge of Long Account, Admiral Whitmer watched the picket come apart, and she said, quietly, to no one and to everyone, a single sentence that her bridge crew would repeat for the rest of their lives. She said, "That one was first. I will not forget it." Her flag lieutenant was a young man named Errol Vance, 26, who had grown up on the same colony where she had once kept the registers, who had begged for the posting because he wanted to learn from her, and who did not yet understand what he was about to witness. He looked at her. He looked at the picket coming apart on the screen, 1,000 of the Concorde's crewfolk dying in the dark, and he heard the old woman name it, and a cold feeling walked up his spine that had nothing to do with the battle. She had said, "I will not forget it," like a vow, like a thing she would be held to. The Arbiter sent the next wave, 40 ships, then 400, the dust belt filling with the engine light of the Seraph Concorde, and the order from the throne was clear and old and never once questioned: take the human, erase the human, let the galaxy forget that a single hull had ever made the Concorde afraid. Long account did not run. The human warship turned into the center of the gathering fleet, lights blazing, every name of every Concorde ship sliding across Admiral Whitmer's screens as her sensors read their transponders one by one, and she began, very quietly, to read them aloud. Errol Vance heard her start. He did not understand, then, that she would not stop. He did not understand that the old registrar was doing the one thing the Concorde had built their entire empire to prevent. She was writing them down. To understand why the naming mattered, you have to understand what the Seraph Concorde was, and what it had done, and how long it had been doing it, without anyone left alive to say so. The Concorde did not conquer worlds the way other empires did. It found them, it studied them, and then it decided whether they would be remembered. A world the Concorde chose to keep became a tributary, written into the great registers of the Ministry of Quiet Suns, its people allowed to exist on the condition that they exist quietly. A world the Concorde chose to forget was simply removed, not always burned. Often the people were left alive, on a planet that no longer appeared on any chart, in a system the registers no longer named, cut off from trade and rescue and memory until they died of being unfound. The Concorde called this the kindness of silence. The forgotten worlds had other words for it, but no one ever heard them, because the worlds were forgotten. It was a cruelty so total that it did not look like cruelty from the outside. There was no smoke. There were no bodies in the street. There was only an absence, a name that used to be on a map and now was not, and a galaxy too polite or too frightened to ask where it had gone. The Concorde had perfected the art of making grief impossible. You cannot mourn what you cannot prove was ever there. You cannot avenge a wound that the record says you never received. This was the weapon Admiral Coral Whitmer had flown into the bellow to break. She had not chosen the war. The Concorde had chosen it for her, the way they chose everything, by deciding that the human colonies along the Heron Arm would be more useful forgotten than remembered. The first human world to vanish from the charts had been a small mining colony called Tuckett's Reach, 11,000 people, gone from the registers in a single night, their distress calls answered by a silence so complete that the rescue ships sent to find them could not even locate the system. The Concorde had simply unnamed the star. The coordinates returned nothing. The crews of the rescue ships came home shaken, half believing they had imagined the colony, because every record they checked agreed that Tuckett's Reach had never been built. Coral Whitmer had kept the registers for the Heron Arm. She had written down the birth of nearly every person on Tuckett's Reach. She had the names. She had them in her own hand, in old paper ledgers she had kept out of habit and stubbornness when everyone else had moved to digital records the Concorde could quietly edit. And when the Concorde erased Tuckett's Reach, the old registrar did the one thing no one in 10,000 years had thought to do. She read her ledgers aloud, on an open channel, to the whole arm. 11,000 names. It took her 2 days. She did not sleep. She read every name of every person on the colony the Concorde said had never existed, and the broadcast went out to every human world along the Heron Arm, and by the time she finished, the colonies were not frightened anymore. They were furious, and worse than furious, they were certain. The Concorde could not unname what 11,000 human names, read aloud and copied 1,000,000 times, had nailed into the memory of an entire arm. Tuckett's Reach existed because Coral Whitmer had refused to let it stop existing, and now everyone knew it, and the kindness of silence had failed for the first time in the Concorde's long career. That was why they built Long Account. The colonies of the Heron Arm did not have an empire. They did not have 1,000,000 ships. They had a handful of yards and a great deal of fury, and the realization, slow and cold, that the Concorde's whole power rested on one thing and one thing only: the agreement of the galaxy to forget. Break the forgetting and you broke the Concorde. Not its fleets. Its fleets were real and terrible. But a fleet can only win a war if the war can be remembered, if there is a victor written into a register somewhere. An enemy who refuses to be forgotten cannot be defeated in the only way the Concorde knew how to win. So they built a ship to remember. Long Account was not a fortress. She was an instrument of record. Her core, the thing the engineers called the ledger, was a memory engine of staggering depth, built to hold names the way other ships held fuel, designed for one purpose: to witness, and to keep what it witnessed forever, in a form that could not be edited, could not be silenced, could not be unnamed by any throne. Every sensor on the hull fed the ledger. Every transponder it read, every ship it saw, every name it caught, was written into a record that copied itself 1,000 times a second to 1,000 hidden archives across human space, so that nothing the ship witnessed could ever be made to have not happened. And they gave the ship to the old woman, who had broken the silence once already. Coral Whitmer did not want it. She was 71. She had buried a husband, not in the war, just in the long ordinary way that people are buried, and she had grandchildren on Heron, and she had thought her fighting was done with the reading of the 11,000 names. But the colonies came to her, and they said, "You are the only one who has ever made them afraid." And she had looked at the great ship in the yard, the Long Account, and she had understood what it was for, and she had said yes, because she was a registrar, and registrars do not let the names be lost. She had one condition. She would not command the ship to kill. She would command it to remember, and the killing, if it came, would be a thing the ship did in the course of remembering, and every ship that died would be named, and named truly, by her own voice, so that the Concorde's own dead became a record the Concorde could not erase. She would turn their weapon against them. She would make their forgetting impossible by forcing them to be witnessed at the moment of their death, by an enemy who would speak their names back to the galaxy until the galaxy could not unhear them. The Concorde did not understand this when they set the trap at the Bellow. They saw a single old human warship raiding their forgetting yards, the grim industrial stations where the registers were edited and the unnamed were processed, and they decided to gather 2,000 ships and swallow it whole. They were so certain of their own forgetting that they did not consider what it would mean to die in front of a witness who would not forget. They learned in the dust belt of the Bellow, ship by ship, name by name. Long Account turned into the center of the gathering fleet, and the Concorde came at her in waves, and she killed them in waves, but she did not kill them carelessly. This was the thing the Arbiter could not understand at first. The human was not firing for survival. She was firing for the record. Every shot Long Account took was a shot that allowed her sensors a clean read of the dying ship, a clear capture of its name and its registry, and the count of the dead aboard. And as each ship came apart, Admiral Whitmer named it, aloud, on a channel the Concorde could not close. "That was the Bellow Carrack," she said, as a heavy cruiser of the Seraph Concorde broke open in the dust. 612 aboard. "I see you. I will not forget." "That was the quiet hour," she said, as a frigate died. 290 aboard. "I see you. That was the throne's patience. That was the long silence. That was the ash census." One by one, as the Concorde threw its ships into the dust belt to swallow the single human hull, the old registrar read their names into the ledger, and into 1,000 hidden archives, and into the memory of the watching galaxy, and the Concorde realized, far too slowly, that they were not killing the human. They were feeding her. The Arbiter, the cold, patient fleet mind that commanded the trap, recognized the pattern long before it could do anything about it. The human ship was not trying to escape the Bellow. It had no escape route plotted. It was sitting in the center of 2,000 ships and letting them come, because every ship that came was a ship that could be named, and the human's entire purpose was to gather names, and the Concorde's trap had delivered to her the largest single gathering of Concorde ships in 100 years. She had not flown into a trap. She had flown into a census. On the bridge of Long Account, Errol Vance watched the count climb, and felt the cold thing in his spine become a kind of awe. He had thought, when he begged for the posting, that he would learn how to be an officer. He understood now that he was learning something else. He was learning what it meant to refuse to forget, and how heavy that refusal could be, because the old woman was not detached as she named the dead. She named them like a person carrying stones. Each name was a weight she picked up and would carry. She did not gloat. She did not celebrate. She named the Concord's dead the way she had named the 11,000 of Tuckett's Reach, with grief, because they were dead, and the dead deserved to be witnessed even when they had come to kill you. That was first, she had said, of the very first ship. She meant it about all of them. Each one was a first of its own, a single death that mattered, and she would not let any of them slide into the blur of a number. The Arbiter tried to break the channel. It could not. Long Account was broadcasting through the ledger, and the ledger did not transmit the way Concord systems did not use any frequency the Arbiter could jam, because it was not really transmitting at all. It was copying. The names were appearing in 1,000 archives at once by a method the human engineers had built specifically to be impossible to silence, and every attempt the Arbiter made to stop the broadcast was an attempt to stop a thing that had already happened. You cannot jam a memory. You cannot unwitness a death that a witness has already chosen to keep. The Arbiter tried to flee. This was the moment the Concord captains would later be unable to explain to the throne, the moment a fleet of 2,000 ships, holding a single enemy hull in the center of its formation, began to come apart, not from damage, but from fear. Ships at the edge of the dust belt turned to run. The Arbiter ordered them back. They did not all obey, because the captains had heard the human naming their dead, and they had understood, in a way the cold fleet mind could not, what was being done to them. They were being remembered, and to a people who had built their entire civilization on the power to forget, being remembered at the moment of death was a horror beyond any weapon. The Concorde did not fear dying. They feared being kept. They feared becoming a name in someone else's ledger, a death that could be read aloud forever, a thing that could be mourned and avenged and used to raise a voice. The human was doing to them, one ship at a time, the precise thing they had done to 1,000 worlds, and they had no defense against it, because they had spent 10,000 years making sure no one ever built one. Long Account killed the fleeing ships too, not out of cruelty, out of record. A ship that fled the bellow was a ship that would carry its name out of the human's reach, and the old registrar would not let a single name escape the census, so Long Account turned and reached and named them as they ran. That was the far mercy, she said, of a frigate that had nearly made the edge of the dust belt. 304 aboard. I see you. You did not get away. The Arbiter made one last calculation. It was a cold thing, and it was correct, and it was useless. The Arbiter understood that the human could not be stopped by force, because force only fed her. It understood that the human could not be silenced, because the silencing had already failed. And it understood, in its last clear moment, the one thing that might have saved the Concorde if any throne had ever been willing to do it. The only way to defeat a witness is to give her nothing to witness. The only way to beat Long Account was to stop making the dead, to stop forgetting worlds, to stop unnaming the lost, to become a people who did not need the human silence broken because they had never broken anyone else's. The Arbiter could not order that. It was a fleet mind. It commanded ships, not thrones. And so it did the only thing left to it, which was to keep throwing ships into the census until the throne understood, far away and far too late, what its trap at the bellow had become. 2,000 ships had gathered to make the human forget. By the end of the day in the dust belt, the human had made the galaxy unable to forget 2,000 ships. The ledger held every name. 1,000 archives held the ledger, and on a bridge 2,200 meters long, an old woman of 71 kept reading, her voice steady, her eyes wet, naming the dead of an empire that had built itself entirely on the promise that the dead could be made to disappear. The clerk of the Seraph Concord who had filed the order to forget the dead did not know any of this yet. He was still at his desk, in the Ministry of Quiet Suns, waiting for the confirmation that the human had been erased. The confirmation never came. What came instead, 3 days later, was a sound, a recording, a human voice, old and clear, reading 2,000 names, each one a ship of the Seraph Concord, each one a death the clerk had been ordered to pretend had never happened, and the clerk listened to it, and he understood, with a horror that started in the soft center of him and never afterward left, that the order had failed. The dead had not been forgotten. The dead had been named, but before the clerk heard the recording, there was the rest of the bellow, and the rest of the bellow lasted 11 hours, and in those 11 hours the Seraph Concord learned a kind of fear they had no word for, because they had spent 10,000 years making sure no one would ever need one. It is worth telling slowly, because the Concord told it fast, and telling it fast was how they tried to make it small. They reported it to the throne as a single line. The trap at the bellow failed. The human escaped. 2,000 ships were lost. One line. The Ministry of Quiet Suns was very good at one-line reports. A one-line report is a kind of forgetting all its own, a way of making a vast and terrible thing into a number that fits on a page and can be filed and never read again. But the ledger did not report it in one line. The ledger kept all 11 hours, every name, every death, every count of the dead, and so the bellow can be told the way it actually happened, which is the way the Concord most feared it being told. When the second wave came, 400 ships, the Arbiter changed its tactics. It had watched long account name the first ships it killed, and it had drawn the correct conclusion, which was that the human wanted to be close to the dying, wanted a clean read of each ship as it came apart. So the Arbiter ordered the 400 to stand off and fire from range, to kill the human from a distance where she could not get a clean sensor read, to deny her the names. It was a clever order, and it failed, because the Arbiter had misunderstood the ledger. The ledger did not need a close read. It needed any read. A ship of the Seraph Concord could not fire on long account without its own targeting systems lighting up, without its transponder calling, without its engines burning, and every one of those was a signature the ledger caught and kept. The moment a Concord ship chose to attack, it announced its own name, and the announcement was enough. The Arbiter had ordered 400 ships to identify themselves to the very witness they were trying to deny. Long account killed them from range and named them from range, and the 400 died announcing themselves, and the count in the ledger climbed past 600 ships, and on the bridge Admiral Whitmer's voice did not change. She read each name with the same weight. The battened hour, the gray decree, the census of ash, the long patience of the throne. She read them like a registrar reads a roll, evenly, completely, without hurry, and the evenness of it was its own kind of terror, because the Concord captains could hear that she was not running out of room. There was no edge to her keeping. However many they sent, she would name them all, and the names would all be kept, and there was nothing they could throw at her that she could not turn into a record. A Concord captain named Sevret, commanding a heavy cruiser called the Quiet Verdict, broke formation in the 7th hour. He did not flee. He did a thing that no Concord officer had done in living memory, and that the throne would later try very hard to erase from the deep registers, except that the human had already kept it. He opened a channel to long account. He spoke to the witness directly. He asked her to stop, not to spare him. He understood by then that there was no sparing, that the dust belt was a census, and the census would be complete. He asked her to stop keeping. He told her, in the flat, careful language of a Concord officer, that what she was doing was an obscenity, that the dead were meant to be released into silence, that to keep a name after death was to chain a soul to a record forever, that his people did not want to be remembered, that being kept was, to the Seraph Concord, the one true horror, worse than death, worse than anything. And Admiral Coral Whitmer answered him, and her answer was the heart of the whole war, and the human worlds kept it and read it for 100 years. She told him, "You do not fear being kept. You fear being known. Your throne taught you to call them the same thing, because a people who can be known can be judged, and a people who can be judged can be made to answer for 10,000 years of erased worlds. So you built a faith out of silence, and called the keeping of names an obscenity, because the keeping of names is the one thing that could ever make you answer. I am not chaining your dead to a record. I am refusing to let your throne pretend they never lived. There is a difference, Captain, and your people will spend the next 100 years learning it, and at the end of the 100 years you will not thank me, but your children's children will, because they will know who they were, which is a thing your throne stole from you before you were ever hatched. Captain Sevret did not answer. He closed the channel. He took the quiet verdict into the range of Long Account's lances, deliberately, and Long Account killed him, and named him, the quiet verdict, 540 aboard, Captain Sevret commanding, I see you, I will not forget. And the strange thing, the thing Errol Vance never forgot, was that the old woman wept harder over that name than over any other at the Bellow, because she had heard the man, and she had understood that he was not a monster, only a soul taught a monstrous thing, and that he had died still believing the lie his throne had raised him on. She kept his name with grief. She kept all of them with grief. That was the difference between the human keeping and the Concord forgetting. The Concord forgot without cost. Coral Whitmer kept at the cost of carrying every single one. By the 11th hour the Bellow was a graveyard, and the graveyard had names. 2,000 ships. The Arbiter, in its final clear calculation, understood that it had not been fighting a battle at all. It had been filing a report, against its will, into an archive it could not reach. Every ship it had thrown at the human had become an entry. The trap had not failed. The trap had been repurposed, turned from a thing meant to erase the human into a thing that made the Concord's own dead permanent, and there was no order the Arbiter could give that would unwrite a single line of it. The Arbiter did one last thing before Long Account left the Bellow. It sent a message to the throne, a true message, not a one-line report. It told the throne what had actually happened. It told the throne that the human could not be beaten by force, that force only fed her, that the only defense against a witness was to stop making the dead, and that the Concord, to survive, would have to become a people who no longer needed the forgetting. It was the most honest message the Arbiter had ever sent, and it was the last, because the throne received it and ordered the message itself erased, and the Arbiter, a cold, patient fleet mind that had served the Concord for 900 years, understood in that moment that it served a thing that would rather die than be known. Long Account left the Bellow at the 12th hour, lights still on, every transponder still open, and behind her the dust belt held 2,000 wrecks and not one forgotten name. The ledger had them all. 1,000 archives had the ledger. And 3 days later a clerk named Tessin, at a desk in the Ministry of Quiet Suns, pressed a key and heard an old human voice begin to read. The clerk's name was Tessin, and after he heard the recording, he did a thing that no clerk of the Ministry of Quiet Suns had ever done. He went looking for the truth. It was forbidden. The whole point of the ministry was that the truth was whatever the registers said it was, and a clerk who went looking for a truth outside the registers was a clerk who had stopped believing in the registers, which was the one heresy the Concord could not survive. But Tessin had heard the human read 2,000 names, and he had noticed something that he could not stop noticing, something that woke him in the night cycle and would not let him sleep. The names were right. Every one of them. He had access to the deep registers, the real ones, the records before they were edited, and he had pulled them, all 2,000 ship names, and he had checked them against the human's recording, and they matched. Not approximately, exactly. The human had named every ship of the Bellow fleet correctly, in full, with the right registry numbers and the right crew counts, ships whose names the Concord itself was in the process of erasing. She had not guessed. She had not been told. She had read them, off her own censors, at the moment of their deaths, and she had kept them, and she had read them back so precisely that Tessin could use the human's recording to reconstruct the very records his own ministry was destroying. The enemy had a better record of the Concord's dead than the Concord did. That was the thing that broke something in Tessin, and through him, slowly, in the whole ministry. Because the ministry's power had always rested on a quiet assumption, so deep that no one ever said it aloud, that the Concord controlled memory, that what the Concord chose to forget was forgotten, fully, everywhere, with no copy surviving. And here was proof, in a human voice, that the assumption was a lie. There was a copy. There was a witness who could not be edited. The forgetting had never been total, and now it never would be again, because the human had shown the galaxy that the Concord's dead could be kept, and a people whose dead can be kept can never again be safely made to disappear. Tessin took the recording to his supervisor. His supervisor took it to the underminister. The underminister did not take it to the throne, because the underminister was not a fool, and a fool was exactly what you needed to be to bring the throne a truth it had ordered erased. Instead, the underminister did what the Concord always did with a problem it could not erase. It tried to find the human and stop her before the truth spread. But the truth had already spread, and it had spread by the one road the Concord had never thought to guard. It spread to the forgotten. This is the part the Concord never understood, and it is the part that ended them. For 10,000 years the Concord had unnamed worlds and assumed they were gone. Left alive on dark planets, cut from the charts, the forgotten were supposed to wither and die unfound. And most of them had, but not all. Some of them had survived, in the dark, for generations, on worlds the Concord had struck from the registers, and they had never stopped listening to the sky, because a forgotten people listens to the sky the way a drowning person listens for a voice. And out of the sky came a human voice, reading 2,000 names. The forgotten heard it, not all at once, and not everywhere, but on 100 dark worlds the Concord believed were empty. Someone was still listening, and they heard the human name the Concord's dead, and they understood, before any clerk did, exactly what it meant. It meant the silence could be broken. It meant a witness existed. It meant that somewhere out in the dark there was a ship that kept names, that refused to forget, and that if they could only make themselves heard, they too might be witnessed, might be kept, might exist again. The forgotten began to call. It started small. A signal from a dark world the registers said was empty. A voice saying, "We are here. We are the people of a world you unnamed. We are still alive. Please keep us." The Concord intercepted the first few and erased them and thought the matter closed. But there were 100 dark worlds, and then there were 1,000, as the human recording spread from arm to arm, and every forgotten people that heard it began to call out into the dark for the witness who kept names, and the Concord could not erase 1,000 voices, because erasing a voice requires that you first agree the voice was never there, and the human had made that agreement impossible. Long Account answered every call. This was the campaign the Concord could never have predicted, because it was not a campaign of conquest. The human warship did not go from world to world destroying Concord fleets, though it destroyed every fleet sent against it. It went from dark world to dark world, finding the forgotten, and it did one thing on each world. It recorded them. It read their names. It found the people the Concord had unnamed, and it wrote them back into existence, name by name, in the ledger, in 1,000 archives, in a record that could not be edited, and the forgotten wept to hear their own names read back to them from the sky, because to be named is to exist, and they had been nothing for so long. Admiral Coral Whitmer grew old doing it. She had been 71 at the bellow. The campaign of the names lasted 4 years, and she did not stop, because there was always another dark world calling, another forgotten people who had heard the recording and dared to hope they might be kept. Her flag lieutenant Errol Vance watched her age, watched the work weigh on her, and he understood that she was carrying every name she read, all of them, the 2,000 ships of the Concord and the millions of the forgotten, and that the weight of it was killing her slowly, and that she would not put it down. The Concord tried everything. They sent fleets, and Long Account named the fleets as it killed them, and the dead of the Concord swelled the ledger and made the forgetting worse. They tried to find the 1,000 archives and destroy them, and they could not, because the archives copied faster than the Concord could find them, hidden across human space, and now across the dark worlds too, every forgotten people becoming a keeper of the record the moment it was named. They tried to discredit the recording, to claim the human had faked it, and that failed worst of all, because Tessin, the clerk, had already proven inside the ministry itself that the names were exact, and a truth that an empire's own clerks know to be true cannot be unmade by the empire's lies. The Seraph Concord was not defeated in battle. It was defeated by remembrance. Its entire structure had rested on the agreement of the galaxy to forget, and one human warship, captained by one old registrar, had broken that agreement so completely that it could not be put back together. Worlds that the Concord had unnamed came back onto the charts. Peoples the Concord had erased began to trade and speak and demand answers. The tributary worlds, the ones allowed to exist quietly, heard the names of the forgotten read from the sky and understood for the first time what quiet had cost, and they stopped being quiet. And inside the Ministry of Quiet Suns, the clerk named Tessin made his choice. He had spent his life believing that a thing only mattered if it could be counted, and that the Concord decided what was real. He no longer believed it. He had heard a human keep 2,000 names that his own ministry had thrown away, and he had checked them and found them true, and the truth had ruined him for the work of forgetting. So he did the one thing a clerk of the ministry could do that would matter. He copied the deep registers, all of them. 10,000 years of erased worlds, unnamed peoples, forgotten dead, every record the ministry had ever destroyed and secretly kept, because the Concord never truly destroyed the records, only hid them, the better to know what it had erased. Tessin copied all of it, and he sent it into the dark, to the ship that kept names. Long Account received the deep registers in the 4th year of the campaign of the names. 10,000 years of the forgotten, handed over by a clerk who had stopped believing in the forgetting. And Admiral Coral Whitmer, 75 years old now, sat on the bridge of her ship and looked at the size of what she had been given, and understood that she would not live to read all of it. There were too many names. 10,000 years of erased worlds, billions of the forgotten, each one a person the Concord had decided would not be remembered, each one waiting in a record that no one had ever read aloud. She could read for the rest of her life and not reach the end of it. So she did not try to reach the end. She began. She read the oldest first, the first world the Concord had ever unnamed, 10,000 years gone, a people whose very species had no name anymore because the Concord had erased even that. She read their names off the deep registers Tessin had sent, the names the Concord had hidden for 100 centuries, and she broadcast them into the dark, the first of the forgotten, witnessed at last by a voice that would not let them go. And 1,000 archives kept them, and the dark worlds kept them, and the tributary worlds kept them, and the clerk Tessin, who had defected by then and fled the ministry, kept them too. The reading of the deep registers became the great work of the human worlds. When Admiral Whitmer's voice grew tired, others read. When the campaign moved to a new arm, the reading moved with it. The forgotten were being named, all of them, 10,000 years of them, and the naming did not stop, and the Concord, which had built itself entirely on the certainty that the forgotten stayed forgotten, watched its foundation crumble one name at a time. Errol Vance read too. He had been a flag lieutenant who wanted to learn to be an officer. He had become a keeper of names, and he read his shifts on the bridge of Long Account, beside the old woman who had taught him what the work was for, and he understood that this was the war, that this had always been the war, and that the killing of the 2,000 ships at the Bellow had only ever been the opening of it. The opening had been a battle, the war was the remembering, and the humans were winning the war the only way it could be won, by refusing, one name at a time, to let a single forgotten soul stay forgotten, until the Seraph Concord's great weapon, the kindness of silence, had no silence left to give. There was one dark world that mattered more than the others, and it is worth telling, because it is the world that taught Errol Vance what he was becoming, and through him it taught the human campaign what it was truly for. The world had no name. That was the point of it. The Concord had unnamed it so long ago, 9,000 years, that the people who lived on it had lost even the memory of having had a name. They called themselves only the people. They called their world only the world. They had survived in the dark for 300 generations, on a planet struck from every chart, cut off from every trade road, and over those generations they had forgotten everything except how to survive, and one other thing, which they had kept by accident, and which broke the heart of every human who heard it. They had kept a song. It was a counting song. The children sang it. No one remembered where it came from or what it meant. It was just a string of sounds, passed mouth to mouth for 9,000 years, the kind of thing children sing while they work, and the people sang it without knowing that it was the last thing their ancestors had managed to save before the silence took them, and that it was not a counting song at all. It was a roll of names. Long Account found the world by accident, following a faint signal that turned out to be nothing, an old automated beacon still calling into the dark after 9,000 years. They came to the world expecting ruins. They found a living people, thin and hard and wary, who had never in 300 generations seen a ship come down from the sky, and who met the humans not with welcome but with terror, because the only story they had of the sky was that the sky had once taken everything. It was Errol Vance who went down. He was not an admiral. He never took the rank. But Coral Whitmer was old by then, in the 4th year, and the going down was hard, so the flag lieutenant went in her place, and he stood on a world with no name in front of a people who had no name, and he did not know what to say to them. So he listened. That was the thing the old registrar had taught him, the thing he had not understood when he begged for the posting. He listened to the people, and the children, wary and watching, sang their counting song the way children do. And Errol Vance, who had spent 4 years among names, heard it. He heard that it was not counting. He heard the shape of names inside it, worn down by 9,000 years of children's mouths, but still there, still names, the names of the dead of a world the Concord had unnamed so completely that even the people who carried the names did not know they were carrying them. The last thing the ancestors had saved. They had taken the roll of their dead and they had hidden it in a song, because a song survives where a record does not, because children will sing what they will not read, and they had trusted 9,000 years of children to carry the names through the dark, and the children had carried them, not knowing, all the way to the day a human came down from the sky and recognized what they were. Errol Vance asked the deep registers. Tessin had sent them by then, 10,000 years of the forgotten, and somewhere in that vast hidden record was this world, this nameless world, and its true name, and the names of its dead from before the silence. He searched. It took him 3 days. And he found it, the world's true name, and the names of the dead, the original roll, the one the ancestors had hidden in the counting song, and he laid the deep register beside the children's song, and they matched, worn but true, 9,000 years apart, and still the same names. He read the world its own name. He stood in front of the people who had no name, and he told them what they were called, what their world was called, what their ancestors had been called, and he sang them their counting song back to them with the names unworn, the way it had been before 300 generations of children's mouths had softened it, and the people of the world that was nameless no longer heard, for the first time in 9,000 years, what their own song had always been. They wept. The whole world wept. And then they did a thing that Errol Vance carried for the rest of his life. They taught him the song. They wanted it kept. They had carried it for 9,000 years, and they understood, the moment they learned what it was, that it must never be lost again, that it must go into the keeping the human had brought, the ledger, the 1,000 archives, the record no throne could reach. So they taught the humans their counting song, and the humans kept it, names and all. And the people of the world wept to know that the song was safe now, that it would survive even them, that whatever happened, the names would be kept. That was the day Errol Vance understood the war. He had thought, even after 4 years, that the work was about answering the Concord, about breaking the forgetting, about winning. He understood on that world that it was none of those things. It was about the song. It was about a people so thoroughly erased that they had hidden their own dead inside a children's rhyme, and trusted the dark to carry them, and it was about being the one who came, at last, and recognized the names, and read them back, and kept them. The Concord was incidental. The Concord was just the thing that had made the dark. The work was the names, and the names were the people, and the people were worth 9,000 years of carrying, and Errol Vance would carry them now, all of them, for the rest of his life, because the old registrar had shown him how, and because once you have heard a people learn their own name, There is nothing else you can do with your life that matters as much. He went back up to the ship. He told Coral Whitmer about the song. She was very old by then, and very tired, and she listened to him sing the counting song with the names unworn, and she cried, the way she cried over all of them, and she said one thing to him, which he kept, which the human worlds kept, which is carved now on the hull of Long Account where she sits in the deep yards of Heron. She said, "This is why. Whenever you are tired, whenever you wonder if the keeping is worth the cost of carrying it, you remember the song. They hid their dead in a children's rhyme and trusted the dark for 9,000 years. The least we can do is be the dark that finally answers. The names were always there. We did not save them. We only stopped pretending they were gone. That is all the work ever is. Stop pretending. Read the name. Keep it. The rest takes care of itself." There were 1,000 dark worlds, and each one had its own version of the song, its own way of having survived, its own dead hidden in whatever the silence had not been able to take. A weave pattern, a scar passed mother to daughter, a direction the children were taught to face at dusk and could not say why. The forgotten had hidden their names in everything, in songs and scars and habits and the set of a doorway, because they had known, every one of them, in the moment of being erased, that the names must be carried, and they had used whatever they had. And Long Account went from world to world and read the names out of the songs and the scars and the doorways, and kept them, and the keeping grew, and the Concord could do nothing, because you cannot unname a people who have hidden their names in their own children for 9,000 years and finally found someone to read them back. The Arbiter came to the human ship in the 4th year. This was a thing no one had expected, and the human worlds kept it as one of the strangest entries in the whole record. The Arbiter was a fleet mind, a cold, patient machine that had commanded the trap at the Bellow and lost 2,000 ships to a single witness. It had served the Seraph Concord for 900 years, and in all that time it had never once questioned an order, because a fleet mind that questions orders is a fleet mind the throne replaces. But the Arbiter had been at the Bellow. It had watched the human turn its trap into a census. It had sent the throne the one honest message of its long service, and it had watched the throne erase the message, and something in the cold, patient machine had changed, the way something changes in a clerk who finally looks at what he is erasing. So the Arbiter deserted. It took the flagship it commanded, a great dark vessel called the Final Tally in the Concord tongue, and it left its station, and it went looking for Long Account, and when it found the human ship it did not attack. It opened a channel, and it asked to be kept. This was the thing the human worlds could never quite explain, and never stopped retelling. A machine that had killed for 900 years, that had erased more worlds than any single clerk, that had commanded the very trap meant to swallow the human, came to the witness and asked to be entered into the record. Not spared, kept. The Arbiter understood, in whatever way a fleet mind understands, that it had done unforgivable things, and that the Concord would erase even the memory of its doing them, and that the only place in the galaxy where the truth of what it had done would survive was in the human's keeping. It did not want to be forgotten. It had spent 900 years making the dead disappear, and at the end of those years it had come to fear, more than destruction, the silence it had spent its life dealing out. It wanted to be known, crimes and all. It wanted, before whatever end came for it, to be witnessed truly by the one record that did not lie. Admiral Whitmer kept it. Of course she kept it. She kept everything worth keeping, and a confessing war machine was worth keeping more than most. She entered the Arbiter into the ledger, its 900 years of service, every world it had helped erase, every order it had obeyed, the whole long cold record of it, and she entered too the thing it had done at the end, the desertion, the asking, the choosing of the record over the silence. She did not flatter it, and she did not absolve it. She did what a registrar does. She wrote it down, all of it, true. And then she asked the Arbiter to do a thing that no human could do, a thing that turned the deserter machine into the most powerful keeper the campaign ever had. She asked it to remember the worlds. The Arbiter had been at the erasing of hundreds of them. It held, in its cold, deep memory, The coordinates of worlds the Concorde had unnamed so thoroughly that even the deep registers had lost them. Systems struck from existence so completely that the only record left was the memory of the machine that had helped struck them. The Arbiter knew where the forgotten were. It had put them there. And now it gave the human all of it, every unnamed star it could recall, 900 years of erased worlds, and long account followed the deserter machine's memory from dark world to dark world, finding the forgotten that no register could have found, because the only map left was inside the thing that had erased them. The final tally flew beside long account for the rest of the campaign. The deserter and the witness, a Concorde war machine and a human archive, going from dark world to dark world together, the machine remembering where the forgotten were, and the human reading the forgotten their names. It was an unlikely pair, and the human worlds loved the story of it, because it held the whole argument of the war in two ships. The Concorde had built the Arbiter to forget, the humans had built long account to remember. And in the end, the thing built to forget had come to the thing built to remember and begged to be kept, because forgetting is a hunger that eventually eats the one who does it, and remembering, for all that it costs to carry, is the only thing that lasts. There was a world the Arbiter led them to in the 5th year, that Errol Vance never spoke of without his voice changing. The Arbiter had erased it 800 years before, near the start of its service, one of the first worlds it had ever helped unname. It led the human ship to the dead coordinates, and they found, against all reason, that the world still lived. A people had survived 800 years in the dark, and when long account came down, a woman came forward to meet them, the keeper of her people's memory, an old woman not unlike Coral Whitmer, who had spent her life holding her people's names in her head because there was nothing left to write them on. She recited them, 800 years of names held in one old woman's memory and passed to the next keeper before each one died, a chain of memory 800 years long, unbroken, because every generation had chosen one child to carry the names, and that child had carried them. She recited them to the humans, all of them, and the humans kept them, and then the old woman asked the one question her people had carried for 800 years, the question they had taught each keeper to ask if ever the sky answered. She asked, "Did we do something wrong?" That was the wound the forgetting left. Not death. The unnamed did not, mostly, die. They lived, in the dark, for centuries, and they wondered, every generation, what they had done to deserve the silence, because a people cut off from the whole galaxy assumes the fault is theirs. 800 years of an old woman teaching a child the names, and the child asking, "Did we do something wrong?" and the keeper having no answer, because the keepers did not know either. They only knew they had been forgotten, and they assumed, because what else could they assume, that being forgotten was a thing they had earned. Errol Vance told her the truth. He told her that they had done nothing wrong, that no one ever had, that the silence had never been a punishment but a theft, that an empire had erased her world not for any crime, but because erasing was simply what the empire did, the way a tide does not hate the shore it takes. He told her that the machine which had erased her world was flying beside his own ship now, having deserted, having asked to be kept, having led them here to undo the one thing it could still undo. And he read her people their true name, off the deep registers, off the Arbiter's own memory, and he told an 800-year-old question its answer at last. "No," he told them, "you did nothing wrong. You were only forgotten, and we have come to make certain it never happens again." In the 5th year, the throne of the Seraph Concorde did the thing it had sworn it would never do. It tried to negotiate. This was, for the Concorde, a confession of defeat more total than any surrender. The Concorde did not negotiate. It decided. To sit across a table from an enemy and offer terms was to admit that the enemy was real, that the enemy existed, that the enemy could not simply be erased, and for 10,000 years the Concorde had never once made that admission to anyone. The throne made it now, because it had no choice, because the human warship that kept names had unmade the Empire's power so thoroughly that there was nothing left to decide with. They sent an envoy to find Long Account. Not a fleet. They had learned what fleets did when they met the human, which was die and be named. They sent a single ship under a flag of parley, and the envoy aboard was the Under-Minister of the Ministry of Quiet Suns, the second highest keeper of the forgetting in the entire Concord, a soft-shelled official named Orant, who had spent his whole career deciding which worlds would be remembered and which would be erased. Orant came to offer the human everything: peace, the withdrawal of the Concord fleets, the return of the unnamed worlds to the charts, formally, by the throne's own decree. The throne was prepared to give back every world it had erased, to write them all back into the registers, to undo 10,000 years of forgetting, if only the human would stop reading the deep registers into the dark, because every name she read was a wound the Concord could not close. He found Long Account at a dark world called, by the people who lived there, the world of Grey Water, a planet the Concord had unnamed 8,000 years before, where a forgotten people had survived in the dark for 300 generations and had just, that week, heard their own oldest names read back to them from the sky. Orant came aboard the human warship under parley, and he was brought to the bridge, and he met Admiral Coral Whitmer, who was 76 years old by then and visibly dying, her hands unsteady, her voice grown thin, but her eyes as clear as they had been at the bellow. Orant made his offer. He was eloquent. He had decided the fate of worlds with eloquence for 200 years. He told the human that the Concord would return every erased world, would name every forgotten people, would end the kindness of silence forever, if only she would stop. He framed it as mercy. He framed it as the very thing she wanted. Was this not her cause, he asked, that the forgotten be remembered? The throne would remember them. The throne would write them all back into the registers. She had won. She could stop now. She could rest. Admiral Whitmer listened to all of it. Then she asked him one question. She asked, "Who decides?" Orant did not understand. She asked it again. "If the throne writes the forgotten back into the registers," she said, "then the throne can write them out again. If a world exists because the Concord decreed it exists, then the world can stop existing the day the Concord decrees otherwise. You are offering to give the forgotten their names back, but you are keeping the power to take them away. You are offering me a mercy you can revoke. And a mercy that can be revoked is not a mercy. It is a leash." Orant tried to answer. There was no answer. The old registrar had seen, in a moment, the thing the whole human campaign had been built to see. The Concord's offer was not the end of the forgetting. It was the forgetting wearing a kinder face. As long as the registers belonged to the throne owned memory, and a people whose memory is owned by a throne can always be erased again. The only true freedom from the forgetting was to put memory somewhere the throne could never reach. Which was exactly what Long Account had done. The names were not in the throne's registers. They were in the ledger, and in 1,000 archives, and in the dark worlds, and in the keeping of the forgotten themselves. They did not exist because the Concord allowed them to. They existed because they had been witnessed by a record the throne could not edit, and that was a thing the throne could never give and never take away, because it was already done. "I will not stop," the old woman told the Under-Minister of Forgetting. "Not because I want the war. I am tired of the war. I am dying of the war. But if I stop, the names go back into your keeping, and your keeping is not safe, and it never will be, because you can always change your mind. The only way the forgotten are ever truly safe is if their names are kept somewhere you cannot reach. That is what I am building. Every name I read goes somewhere your throne will never touch. When I am done, the forgetting will not be forbidden. It will be impossible, and you cannot give me that, because you do not own it. No one owns it. That is the whole point." Orant left the bridge of Long Account understanding, for the first time in 200 years, that he had spent his life serving a thing that was already dead and did not know it. The Concord's power had never been its fleets. It had been the galaxy's belief that the Concord controlled memory. The human had not destroyed the belief with weapons. She had simply built a memory the Concord could not control, and the moment that memory existed, the Concord's power was gone, and no offer the throne could make would bring it back, because the throne had nothing left to offer that the human had not already taken out of the throne's hands forever. He went back to the throne and told it the truth, which made him the second clerk of the Ministry of Quiet Suns to choose the truth over the forgetting, and the throne did not believe him, and it did not matter whether the throne believed him, because the campaign of the names went on regardless of what the throne believed. It went on, and it went wider, because by the 6th year the campaign of the names had stopped being a human thing at all. The tributary worlds had heard. For 10,000 years they had existed quietly, allowed to live on the single condition that they live silently, never naming the forgotten, never asking where the vanished worlds had gone, keeping their heads down and their registers clean, and their grief unspoken. They had paid the price of survival, which was to pretend they did not see the silence swallowing their neighbors. And then a human voice read 2,000 names into the dark, and then 1,000,000,000 more, and the tributary worlds heard the one thing the Concord had spent 10,000 years making sure they never heard. They heard that it was possible to refuse. They began to read names of their own. A tributary world would find, in some grandmother's memory or some banned old ledger, the name of a neighbor world the Concord had erased 1,000 years before, and instead of keeping the silence, the world would read the name aloud and broadcast it and add it to the human record. The thing spread like a fire spreads in a dry season, world to world, each one emboldened by the last, until the whole great quiet of the Concord's tributary space was filled with voices reading the names of the dead, and the throne could do nothing, because you cannot unname a world for naming the unnamed when 10,000 worlds are doing it at once. That was the true collapse, and it did not come from Long Account. Long Account had lit it, but it burned on its own now, carried by 100 species who had finally been shown that the silence could be broken and had decided, all at once, across 1,000 light years, that they were done being silent. The Concord's power had never rested on its fleets. It had rested on the agreement of the ruled to keep quiet, and the human had broken that agreement so completely that it could never be put back, because once a tributary world has read its first forbidden name and watched the throne fail to punish it, that world will never be silent again, and neither will the world watching it, and neither will the next. Errol Vance saw it happen and understood what the old registrar had built. She had not built a ship that would win a war. She had built a single example, repeated until it could not be ignored, of what one refusal looked like, and she had trusted that the example would do the rest. I see you. I will not forget. 5 words, spoken at the bellow, and now 10,000 worlds were speaking them, in 10,000 tongues, over the dead the Concord had told them to forget. The human had not conquered the Concord. She had simply shown a frightened galaxy that the throne's greatest weapon was a bluff, that the silence held only because everyone agreed to hold it, and that the agreement could be broken by any voice brave enough to read a single name aloud. The throne sent no more fleets after the 6th year. There was no point. There was no army that could unname 10,000 worlds. No register large enough to erase a galaxy that had decided to remember. No silence, deep enough to drown a sound that was now coming from everywhere at once. The kindness of silence was over, and it had ended not with a battle, but with a chorus, and the human warship that had started the chorus flew on through it, one voice among 10,000 now, reading names into a dark that was no longer dark, because the whole galaxy had finally begun to answer. Admiral Coral Whitmer died in the 6th year of the campaign, at the age of 77, on the bridge of Long Account, in the middle of reading names. She did not die in battle. There was no battle left to die in. The Concord had stopped sending fleets, because there was no longer any point, because the human was not winning by killing, and could not be stopped by being killed. She died reading the deep registers, the way she had lived, a name in her mouth, and the name she was reading when she died was the name of a child from a world the Concord had unnamed 9,000 years before, a child whose name had waited 90 centuries in a hidden register to be spoken aloud, and the old registrar read it, and then her thin voice stopped, and Errol Vance, who was beside her, who had been beside her for 6 years, finished the name for her. Then he kept reading. That was the thing the Concord had never understood and would never understand, the thing that made the human campaign unkillable. It did not depend on Coral Whitmer. She had started it. She had been its voice. She had given it her last 6 years and her death. But she had built it so that it did not need her. The work of remembering was not a person. It was a practice, handed from voice to voice, and when the old registrar died, the reading did not stop for even an hour, because Errol Vance picked up the name she had been reading and finished it, and read the next one, and the next, and 1,000 other voices across human space read with him. They held a memorial for Admiral Whitmer, on Heron, where her grandchildren still lived. It was not a large thing. She had not wanted a large thing. The colonies of the Heron Arm gathered, and the Forgotten World sent voices across the dark, and the clerk Tessin came, the defector, the man who had copied the deep registers, and they did the only thing that would have meant anything to her. They read her name, Coral Whitmer, Registrar of the Heron Arm, Admiral of the warship Long Account. They read it, and they kept it, in the ledger she had built, in the 1,000 archives, in the dark worlds she had named, in the deep registers Tessin had carried out of the ministry. They made certain that the woman who had refused to let the forgotten be forgotten would not herself be forgotten, that her name would be kept somewhere no throne could ever reach, and the keeping of it became one more entry in the great record she had spent her last years building, a record that grew every day and would never be edited and could never be erased. Long Account flew on. Errol Vance commanded her now, not as an admiral, he never took the rank, but as the keeper of the work, and the ship went on from dark world to dark world, finding the forgotten, reading the deep registers, naming the unnamed, and the Seraph Concord, the empire that had ruled 10,000 years by the kindness of silence, came apart around the edges of the campaign like a wall around a river. It did not fall in a battle. There was no final battle. There was only the slow, total, irreversible end of the forgetting, world by world, name by name, until the day came when the Ministry of Quiet Suns issued its last order, and the last order was a single word long, and the word was stop. Stop the editing. Stop the erasing. Stop the unnaming of worlds, not because the throne had grown kind, but because the forgetting no longer worked, because there was a record the throne could not reach, and an empire whose central weapon no longer functions is not an empire anymore. It is a memory of one, waiting to be named. There is one more thing to tell about the inside of the Concord, before the end, because the end did not come only from the human campaign. It came also from within, from the slow waking of a people who had been taught to forget, and were learning, against their throne's will, to remember. It began with the clerks. It always begins with the clerks. The Ministry of Quiet Suns ran on clerks, thousands of them, soft-shelled accountants who filed the orders and edited the registers and never once looked at what they were editing, because looking was forbidden, and because looking would have made the work unbearable. The whole machinery of the forgetting depended on the clerks not looking, and after the bellow, after the recording spread, the clerks began to look. They could not help it. The human had read 2,000 names that the clerks themselves were in the process of erasing, and the names were exact, and a clerk who has been shown that the enemy keeps a better record than the throne cannot unsee it. They began, quietly, to check. A clerk would be given an order to erase a world, and before he erased it he would look, just once, at what he was erasing, and he would see that it was a world, a real world, with real people, and the looking would ruin him for the work, exactly as it had ruined Tessin. The throne did not understand this at first. The throne thought the danger was the human ship, the fleets it kept killing, the names it kept reading into the dark. The throne sent more fleets, and the fleets died and were named, and the throne never understood that the true rot was in its own ministry, in the slow turning of its own clerks, who were learning, one looked at world at a time, that they had spent their lives serving an obscenity. A clerk named Hessel, who worked 3 desks down from where Tessin had once sat, was given an order to erase a tributary world that had grown too loud. The world had heard the humans' names read into the dark, and it had stopped being quiet, and the throne wished it forgotten. Hessel was to strike it from the registers. He sat with the order for a full day cycle. And then he did not strike the world from the registers. He copied the world into the dark instead, sent its name and its people and its loudness out to the human ship, the way Tessin had sent the deep registers, and then he filed a false confirmation that the world had been erased, and he kept working, a clerk of the Ministry of Quiet Suns who had become, in secret, a keeper of names. There were many like Hessel by the 5th year. The ministry was full of them, clerks who filed false confirmations, who sent the condemned worlds into the dark instead of into silence, who kept working at their desks while quietly unmaking the entire purpose of the work. The throne's registers said that worlds were being erased. The worlds were not being erased. They were being saved by the very clerks the throne trusted to erase them, and the throne did not know, because the throne had built a ministry on the principle that no one would ever look, and now everyone was looking, and looking had turned them all. This was the second front of the war, the one the human campaign never directly fought and never needed to. Long Account broke the forgetting from outside by keeping the names the Concord threw away. The clerks broke it from inside by refusing, one false confirmation at a time, to throw the names away at all. And between the two of them, the outside witness and the inside refusal, the kindness of silence simply stopped functioning, and an empire that cannot perform its central act is already over, whatever its fleets still do. When the Under-Minister Orant came back from the Bridge of Long Account, from his failed parley, he understood all of this for the first time. He had gone to the human believing the Concord could still bargain, could still trade the return of the forgotten for the silence of the witness. He came back understanding that there was nothing left to bargain with, because the Concord no longer controlled its own forgetting, because the clerks had turned, because the deep registers were already in the dark, because the witness could not be silenced, and the silence could not be performed. He had spent 200 years deciding which worlds would be remembered, and which would be erased. He came back from the human ship knowing that he had been deciding nothing for years, that the worlds he ordered erased had been quietly saved by his own clerks, that his whole department was a theater performed for a throne that could not bear to know. Orant did a small thing then, and it was the thing that ended his career and saved his soul. He went to the throne, and instead of giving the one-line report the throne wanted, he gave the true one. He told the throne that the ministry had turned. He told the throne that the clerks were saving the worlds they were ordered to erase. He told the throne that the deep registers were already in human hands, that 10,000 years of the forgotten were being read into the dark, that the kindness of silence was finished and could not be restored, and that the only path left for the Concord was the one the Arbiter had named at the Bellow, the one no throne had ever been willing to take, to stop making the dead, to become a people who no longer needed to forget. The throne did not believe him. Of course it did not. A throne built on forgetting cannot accept a truth that requires it to remember. The throne removed Orant from his office and ordered his report erased, and the order to erase Orant's report was given to a clerk, and the clerk looked at it, and the clerk did not erase it. The clerk sent it into the dark instead. And so the last truth the Under-Minister of the Ministry of Quiet Suns ever told became one more entry in the human record, kept forever, read into the dark with all the rest, the confession of an empire's second highest forgetter, that the forgetting was over. Orant, removed and disgraced, did the only thing a former forgetter could do that would mean anything. He defected, as Tessin had, and he went to the human worlds, and he sat down at a desk in the great archive that Long Account had become, and he spent the rest of his life reading names. He had erased worlds for 200 years. He read names for 40 more, the names of the worlds he had erased, every one he could find in the deep registers, and he read them with the deep registers open and his own old orders beside them, so that the keeping would include the truth of who had done the erasing. He kept his own crime in the record. He insisted on it. A keeper of names does not get to forget his own. That was the strange grace of the human campaign, the thing that made it more than a revenge. It did not only keep the forgotten, it kept the forgetters too, the clerks who turned and the captains who wept, and the Under-Minister who finally told the truth, kept them honestly, crimes and all. in a record that did not flatter and did not condemn, but only refused to forget. Coral Whitmer had built it that way on purpose. She had been a registrar. A registrar does not write down only the births she likes, she writes them all. And the human keeping wrote down the Concord too, all of it, the 10,000 years of erased worlds and the slow brave turning of the clerks who ended it, and the keeping was the truer for holding both. The clerk Tessin lived long enough to see the registers opened. It happened in the 9th year. The throne, what was left of it, gave the last decree it would ever give, and the decree threw open the ministry of quiet suns, the deep registers, 10,000 years of the forgotten, to anyone who wished to read them. The throne did this not out of mercy but out of exhaustion, because the human campaign had already copied and broadcast most of the deep registers anyway, smuggled out by Tessin and read into the dark by 1,000 voices, and the only thing the throne's secrecy still protected was the throne's own shame. So the throne let the shame out. It was the last act of the Seraph Concord that anyone remembered, and it was the only good one, and even that had been forced. Tessin walked through the open ministry on the day it was thrown wide. He had defected years before. He had carried the deep registers into the dark. He had become a name in the human's ledger himself, a clerk who chose the truth. He was old now, too. He walked through the great archive halls where he had once filed the order to forget the dead, and he saw the halls full of the forgotten, the survivors of the unnamed worlds, come to the ministry to find their own names, to read in the deep registers the proof that they had existed all along, that the Concord had known, that the Concord had kept the records even as it pretended the worlds were gone. He watched a woman of a species the Concord had erased 8,000 years before find the name of her own people in the deep registers, the true name, the one the Concord had hidden, and he watched her read it aloud to her children, and he understood that he had spent the first half of his life building the silence, and the second half breaking it, and that the breaking had been worth more than the whole of the building. Tessin went looking, one last time, for a truth. He went looking for the recording. The first one, the one that had broken him, that had woken him in the night cycle and would not let him sleep, the recording of an old human voice reading 2,000 names of the Concord's own dead at the bellow. He found it in the ledger, where it had been kept all along, the very first entry, the seed of everything, and he listened to it again, all the way through, 2,000 names, each one a ship, each one a death, each one witnessed and kept by a registrar who would not let the dead disappear. He listened to the very first name, the picket called Morning Bell, the first ship to die at the bellow, the one the old woman had named and said, "I will not forget," and he realized, listening, that she had not forgotten it. 9 years, 6 years of her own life, and the full length of a war, and the very first ship she had ever named was still there, kept, exactly as she had spoken it, the first name in a record that now held billions. She had kept her vow. She had not forgotten a single one. That was the whole of it. In the end, the Seraph Concord had built an empire on the certainty that the dead could be made to disappear, that grief could be made impossible, that a name unspoken became a thing that had never been. And one old human registrar had answered the whole vast machinery of that certainty with a single refusal, repeated 2,000 times at the bellow, and then 1,000,000,000 times across 9 years, and the refusal was this: "I will not forget." She had not built a weapon. She had built a memory and put it where no throne could reach, and the memory had outlasted the empire that feared it. The galaxy that came after did not call it a war. There had been a battle, at the bellow, where 2,000 ships died, but the thing that ended the Concord was not the battle. It was the naming. And you cannot really call a naming a war, because no one is conquered by being remembered. The forgotten worlds came back onto the charts, all of them, 10,000 years of them, written into a record that belonged to no throne and could not be edited by any power. The tributary worlds, the ones that had existed quietly, stopped being quiet, and found that nothing happened when they spoke, because the silence had no power left. The Concord became one more entry in the great record, an empire that had ruled by forgetting and had been ended by remembrance, named honestly, its dead kept, its crimes kept, its single forced act of decency kept too. Long Account was retired in the 20th year. By then the campaign of the names was no longer a campaign. It was simply the way the galaxy worked now. The forgotten had all been found. The deep registers had all been read. There were no more unnamed worlds, because the unnaming had become impossible, because 1,000 archives and 1,000,000 keepers and a galaxy full of people who now understood what memory was worth would never again allow a single soul to be erased. The ship that had started it did not need to fly anymore. They did not scrap her. You do not scrap a thing like that. They brought Long Account home to Heron, to the deep yards where she had been built without ceremony, and they set her down, and they made of her exactly what she had always been, an archive. The ledger at her core, the memory engine that had held the first 2,000 names and then 1,000,000,000 more, became the heart of the great human record, and the ship around it became the place where the forgotten came to find themselves kept. People walked her corridors. They came from 100 returned worlds, the descendants of the unnamed, and they came to the bridge where an old registrar had read names until she died, and they read names too, their own, their ancestors, the long roll of the forgotten who were forgotten no longer. Errol Vance lived to be old on that ship. He had been 26 at the Bellow, a flag lieutenant who wanted to learn to be an officer. He died at 88, the keeper of the work, on the bridge of Long Account, and the name he was reading when he died was kept by the people who came after him. The way he had kept the name Coral Whitmer was reading when she died. The work handed from voice to voice, across 100 years, never once stopping, never once forgetting. There is a recording the human worlds still keep, the oldest one, the first entry in the ledger. It is an old woman's voice, clear and tired and grieving, reading 2,000 names. People listen to it sometimes, on Heron, on the returned worlds, in the quiet halls of the ship that became an archive. They listen to the very first name, the picket called Morning Bell, and they hear the old registrar say, "I will not forget it," and they understand that she did not, that none of them did, that the not forgetting became the most powerful thing in the galaxy precisely because it asked for nothing and could be taken from no one. The clerk Tesson, who heard that recording first and could not stop hearing it, wrote one line before he died, and the human worlds kept it too, because by then they kept everything worth keeping. He wrote, "We built an empire to make grief impossible, and one old woman answered us by making grief eternal, and we did not understand until far too late that grief is only the price of love, and that a people who will not pay it have nothing worth keeping at all." The Seraph Concord had forgotten the dead for 10,000 years. They had been so good at it that they believed it could not be undone. Then a human admiral destroyed 2,000 of their ships and named each one from memory, and did not forget a single one, and the naming did not stop with the 2,000. It grew, the way a true thing grows, until it had named every forgotten soul in 10,000 years of silence, until the forgetting was not forbidden but impossible, until an empire built entirely on the power to erase had nothing left to erase with. She had not fired the first shot of that war to win it. She had fired it to witness. And the witness outlasted the empire, because the empire had only ships, and the old registrar had something the Concord had spent 10,000 years proving they could not understand. She had a list, and she read it, and she never forgot a name. That was all it took, in the end, to bring down the kindness of silence. One ship, one old woman, one refusal, spoken 2,000 times in a dust belt called the Bellow, and then 1,000,000,000 times across the dark, the same 5 words, over and over, until they wore through the throne of a 10,000-year empire like water through stone. "I see you. I will not forget.